This meeting is being
Okay.
Hi everyone. Oh gosh, sorry, my screen's being hit. Okay. It's wonderful to see everyone here. And happy Thanksgiving from America. So I want to welcome Isaac Fradken, who is doing what I think is really excellent work, and I'm really excited to hear about more what he's been doing lately. So Isaac, I met a few years ago. He was working actually in London at the time with Ray Dolan and was really sort of doing work at what I think of as the cutting edge between um, language, but also sort of reinforcement learning and, well, not exactly reinforcement learning, but sort of algorithms that are based on sort of motivation and the ability and various sort of computational as algorithms that he was now sort of applying to aspects of language uh, production, which I think is really kind of unusual. I mean, in my sort of my life, I meet people who aren't really coming from that background, and so, um, uh, and then as a couple of years later, I saw a really amazing paper that came out of his lab, which was basically quantifying some language production, um, but in terms of looking at large language models, I think it was GPT-2, um, and but trying to sort of quantify actually the language produced by GPT-2 in terms of thought disorder. It was a really original and important paper and formed a basis of and really gelled very nicely with some stuff that Lena and I were doing. And so, I mean, always in his work, I've just found this sort of deep thought and originality, which I've always been excited about. He is now at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem, where he's leading a lab that looks at sort of various different aspects of semantic association, both in schizophrenia as well as in healthy adults. And and I'm excited to see what he's been doing lately.
Thank you so much for the lovely introduction, Gina. It's really great seeing all of you, those of you who I've already met and those of you who haven't met, but I know your names from tons of papers. It's also great to be what up to now has been somewhat not very active part of this core group, but very much looking forward to be more active. I think it's really great endeavor and really great to see that it's happening at this scale and with such success. So my talk today is going to be actually Gina related to, I think, one of the papers you mentioned and an extension of it. And the general idea I want to propose here today is that maybe we can improve the way we can and are using language models and natural language processing in the context of psychiatry. And by improving it, what I mean is make it closer and better explainable and more related to theory. And the approach I want to present for this is by the use of generative language models. But before actually getting into NLP and language and so on, I want to go many, many steps back to sort of stats 101 and just think about how we examine what our models actually measure. So imagine the scenario where you're interested in the relationship between two variables. Let's call them X and Y. And let's say that you calculate the Pearson correlation between these variables and you find a correlation that is something like minus 0.02. Okay, so oftentimes we might conclude from this that there's basically no relationship. But what if you knew or saw that the actual relationship looks like this? I think it becomes pretty clear that when you are able to see the data in this way, you will no longer conclude that there's no relationship. You will rather say something or think something about the fact that there's basically your models, the models you're using do not really match the data you're testing. So it's a very, very simplistic example that tries to really illustrate this process that is really at the core of most statistical models and also of most computational models we use in psychiatry and beyond, where we always want to be able to visualize our data in order to compare it to the model predictions. Point is that taking this principle and into account and thinking of it when we try to do or when we do natural language processing for psychiatry becomes very difficult. And one of the reasons it becomes difficult is because it is really hard to actually visualize our data, actual free language, unconstrained language, in a way that becomes very intuitive. We can look at the data, and here's an example of a patient with schizophrenia and also quite severe thought disorder that took part in one of our studies. And when we asked this patient to describe an average person's daily routine, he said something like breathing for a start, fail to breathe and you may as well be dead, breakfast, but before the first meal of the day, attend your ablutions. He actually wrote it, he didn't say it. Then the commute to the office, shop, or hospital, or library if you are employed as a librarian. Then the daily stress of dealing with a great unwashed public. Geez, they make you sick, and so on and so forth. And basically, it went farther and farther away from the original question. So it's very clear from looking at this that there's something that went awry with this text. It looks derailed, it looks tangential. But even though it's clear, it still is not so trivial to actually think about this in a diagram or a plot or in a very visualized way that allows us to compare it to specific models. And indeed, the second part of the difficulty of testing what our models actually measure is that what we usually do when we use NLP, the automatic types of NLP, we rely on models that have been trained on large corpora, sometimes the whole internet. The models themselves can be more or less intelligible. Some of them are completely, black box sort of hierarchical neural networks. And even though the model can be used, some of them can be used to derive predictions. Many times, what we actually do is not really derive predictions for the models, but actually derive metrics from the models. Sorry, okay. Yeah, I forgot to say that if you have clarification questions, feel really free to interrupt me, and I think we'll try to leave the more interesting discussion to the end. Right. So I was saying that basically the second part of the problem lies in the fact that we cannot so often derive predictions from these models, and we cannot really visualize the data in a way that will allow us to actually compare the data to our models to see if the models actually measure what we think or hope that they measure. And just to give a very, very illustrative example, if we look at the text that has been reported by this patient from before and compare it to a different answer from a different participant, that is indeed very, very different. And this participant, what they did is in response to our question of please describe in details what steps are usually involved with people's daily routine, they just repeated the question over and over again. They did it in writing. They probably did it because they had to write a certain minimum amount of words. But I think it really would make the point even better thinking about this very stupid example. And the point that I'm trying to make here is that if we measure word-to-word cosine distance, here using word to back, and here we use each word, its distance to the consecutive word, we find that the values actually are not that different. And, sort of to qualify this, it's definitely a very non-random example I'm giving here. And it cannot say, something general about the validity of cosine distance to measure derailment, but I think it makes a point in the sense that it would be really hard to know from the metric itself that the narratives and their characteristics are so different. So what has been done very successfully and remarkably, I think, in the past 10 or maybe even more, I think, years, 15 years, I think to try and answer the question of what these models actually measure is mainly using two main methods. One of these approaches relies on convergent validity, for instance, testing correlations with clinical ratings. Some of these studies have shown quite remarkable correlations that we don't so much see in experimental research, like zero point 0.7. Others have shown lower correlations, but I think the more important point in why this approach may be somewhat insufficient is that maybe we don't only want to use NLP as a quick automatic diagnostic tool, but rather maybe we want to also be able to use them to capture, maybe even explain phenomena that is not necessarily evident clinically. A second approach has focused on predictive validity, which usually means using a bunch of metrics and combining them with different machine learning techniques in order to detect schizophrenia or predict conversion to psychosis. These studies have also been very successful and very, very impressive, I would say, but I think that they do not really answer the question I pose here. They do not really answer the question of what it is that individual metrics actually measure. So when we aggregate metrics in a weighted way with a machine learning model, it makes them less rather than more interpretable in many cases. And here is just another illustration, which is quite outdated today. It has been done at around 2022, I think, where we actually aggregated the data. And it's not meant to be a systematic meta-analysis, and the effects themselves and the directions themselves are not really critical. The main point I want you to sort of take from this slide is the heterogeneity, is the extent to which different studies have been using different metrics in different ways. And by this, I mean that we can measure the distance, here focusing only on semantic distance or cosine similarity metrics. So we can measure distance between words or sentences. We can measure between consecutive words or between all the words in the text. When we measure these distances, we can aggregate them across the pairs of words in many different ways. We can take the average, we can take the variance, we can take the minimum, the maximum, and so on and so forth. So what I want to propose here today is that despite the very impressive progress that has been made thanks to NLP and more recently large language models, we might be along the way sacrificing something that has to do with the psychometric transparency of these metrics and with our theoretical understanding of what they measure. So how can we approach this problem when we have this difficulty of visualizing data and of deriving concrete predictions from models and of comparing them to one another to ensure that the models actually measure what we think that they measure? What I want to propose here today and what we have been working on in one line of our research is that generative language models, starting from a very simple one like GPT-2, can actually help in this case. And the way in which they can help is that when we take a generative language model and we can manipulate different parameters, and we will choose parameters or hyperparameters that are driven by theory. And just a word of sort of qualification here, when I'm talking about the manipulation of parameters in these models, I'm not talking about changing their weights or changing the memory of the model. I'm talking about playing with or manipulating the hyperparameters that govern the generation process given a specific model, given a specific structure of weights and so on and so forth. When we manipulate theory-driven parameters, the next step is that this can allow us to actually derive predictions. And these predictions, because we use these generative models that, today we know that how capable they are, will basically allow us to derive predictions that look or can look sort of the same as our actual data, that is free, unconstrained text. Another thing that is important to say here, in all of the work that we've done so far for this purpose, for the production purpose, we mainly use the simpler language models. And by this, what I mean is that we use models that are not fine-tuned, that have not gone through, RLHF and different and all the different layers of fine-tuning that are used today in things like ChatGPT and Gemini and so on. Because we're really only interested in these models' ability to predict and generate the next word. So I'll present two studies today. One is a bit older and one is very new. The first study tries to suggest that we can use this method to test something about mechanisms of derailment in thought disorder, and specifically comparing a mechanism that is related to some sort of noise in the retrieval process to a mechanism that is related to impaired integration of semantic context. And the second study, I will talk about the perhaps not trivial need to disentangle derailment and perseveration when we examine free text in the context of formal thought disorder. So starting from the first study, if there are any, again, clarification questions of anything I've said up to now, please feel free to interrupt. If not, I'll just continue. So what we'll try to do in the first study is indeed see if language and NLP metrics can be actually used to test and also dissociate two potential mechanisms of derailment. The first mechanism is this idea that has been suggested in few models and maybe is common in more sort of lay perception of loosening of association, is this idea that the loosening of association or derailment may reflect some sort of noise, stochasticity, or random processes in linguistic or semantic retrieval. We want to compare this mechanism to a mechanism that has been tested more rigorously in the literature. And this is the idea that at least some of the phenomena we know from positive thought disorder reflect a difficulty or impairment in the integration of longer context, longer linguistic or semantic or other types of context. And it turns out that it's actually quite easy to manipulate these two mechanisms using a generative language model. Here we used GPT-2. It was done many, many years ago, as you see, when GPT-2 was the only accessible model we had. It's amazing how things advance in this field, really making it hard to follow. So what we did is really simple. We gave the model a bunch of prompts, and we asked it to basically continue to generate a whole narrative with a fixed length. And we manipulated two parameters. To manipulate the randomness of retrieval, we simply manipulated the temperature parameter. Let me see if you... I hope you can see my mouse here. So what this basically means is that if for a sort of normal model, a narrative that starts with the words most people start the day by, continuing it with something like running away into the blah, 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 is very, very unlikely. When we increase the temperature, this continuation becomes more likely, more probable. The second manipulation we use is also quite simple. We manipulated the memory span of the model in order to create a sort of crude formulation of an impaired integration of context. And what this really meant is, without changing the temperature, we simply gave the model shorter context such that it cannot remember everything that it has said or produced just a few words ago. And what this leads to is, so this example over here, for example, that instead of seeing the full sentence, most people start the day, the model here only sees the last three words as an example, the day by, and this can lead to a continuation like the day by day basis to maintain, and which makes sense if we take into account this context, but doesn't really make sense if we take into account the actual full context. So we manipulated these two parameters, and then our goal was to derive predictions from these manipulations. And what you see here on the screen are sort of, illustrative predictions in the actual text itself, but we want to derive the predictions in a way that would allow us to quantify them in some way because of exactly the problem of actually visualizing these texts in a compact or intelligible way. And what we did for this is derive the predictions or test the generated narratives with the kinds of semantic distance metrics that have been used and are still some of them used quite frequently in the literature. And again, by this I mean using metrics that capture a semantic distance between words or between sentences, using static or contextualized embedding models, and so on and so forth. And the point is that by deriving these predictions, we will be actually able to see, it will allow us to see the extent to which each manipulation changes the values of these different metrics. So let's skip directly to the results, and I'll walk you through them. So at the top here, you can see plots for the results of the random retrieval manipulation. And in the bottom, you can see the results for the impaired integration of context manipulation. And here we only focus on results for the metrics that measure distances between words. So the first thing we can see, which is not very surprising, is that random retrieval increases the distances between words, right? So the higher is the temperature, the larger are the distances between either all the words or consecutive words. This is not very surprising and in fact quite expected. Things become a bit more interesting when we look at the predictions that stem from the impaired integration of context. What we see here is that impaired integration of context can actually do the opposite. It can reduce distances between words. Now, we see this in these reductions over here. We also see this in the R values, in the correlation values between memory span and semantic distance. Now, the reason, let's focus on this plot for now because it's slightly simpler. If we think about it, the reason for which impairing the integration of context, or really, reducing the model's memory leads to this prediction is not very surprising. The reason is that when we give the model less of a context, it will this word level context in some cases, and in these cases over here, will have a much greater influence on the next produced or selected word, such that preceding context will have less of an influence. But because the local context has less of an influence, has more of an influence, sorry, this would almost necessarily or logically mean that the distances between consecutive words at the word level will actually be reduced in completely the opposite of what we see or predict in the case of random retrieval. Another important or interesting thing we see here in these predictions is that impaired integration of context, its effect, at least for some metrics, is not really linear. It's not even monotonic. We see that it can reduce semantic distance up to a certain level of impairment, but then it can increase semantic distance again after a certain level of impairment. And thinking about such a generative process, thinking about if this is actually the case that these effects are not monotonic, I think it becomes very clear how it will be very, very much more complicated to actually understand what's going on with patients where we might get a mixture of people with different levels of impairments. Here we look at what happens at models that focus on distance between sentences. The first, perhaps most evident finding here is that static models, that is models like Word2Vec or Glow, capture, try to quantify sentences by averaging their words or something like this, averaging the static embeddings of their words, do not really perform well in capturing these manipulations. So even though we increase the temperature quite dramatically, here, for instance, if we capture distance between sentences by taking the most classical method that has been used, 10 years ago, and so we actually get a reduction of semantic distance rather than an increase in semantic distance between sentences, which is, I think, quite surprising and might be problematic. We see that the use of contextualized models does or performs much, much better. We see the expected increase in semantic distance with increasing threshold. We also see here the expected increase in semantic distance with impaired integration of context, but we still see that the effects of impaired integration of context, the predicted effects, are still not monotonic. So they're still complicated, they depend on the model. The actual correlation we see here, if we measure the linear correlation for a non-monotonic effect, it would really vary and depend on the exact shape of these effects, which again really make it clear why this might complicate analysis for actual patients. So the next slide is really not something I want to analyze in depth, but what this slide shows is that the choice of an aggregation method, which is often something we don't give maybe a lot of attention to, that is, again, when we have distances between sentences or between words, we have a vector of these for the entire text, and then we have to decide whether to take the average of these distances, the maximum distance, the minimum distance, the variance. What this slide tries to show is basically that this choice really, really matters. That depending on the exact perturbation, the exact manipulation, we will get very different effects, sometimes opposing effect, depending on the type of or the actual aggregation method we use. But to summarize this study, we see that different theories can lead to different, sometimes opposing predictions. And what really helped us sort of detect this or find this or discover this is the use of generative models where we manipulated parameters instantiating these theories. We see that the effects of impaired integration of context are quite complex, not linear, and not even monotonic. And here, additional methods that do not only rely on distance could actually help us maybe in capturing them better. And shout out to this recent paper published by Gina and Victoria trying to propose such a method. We also saw more generally that the choice of models, that is contextualized versus static, the choice of aggregation methods, as well as other choices can have dramatic effects on what these metrics are able to capture, what these metrics are able to measure, and as an effect of that, substantial effects on the validity of our findings. And the proposal that I'm trying to sort of that may seem radical, I don't know, or provocative, but the proposal that I'm trying to make here is that maybe such choices should be, as much as possible, informed by theoretical justifications using simulations, and not only by predictive validity, that is, how much they are able to improve our predictions regarding conversion or regarding group allocation and so on and so forth. So I'll stop again maybe for a few seconds to see if there was something unclear about this study that you want me to address before moving forward to the second study.
I have a quick question. So every time I read this, I know it's really important and it's so interesting. Hadn't quite picked that up on your paper, but yeah, it's so interesting about the perseverance because we found exactly the same thing and sort of like, what does that mean? Like, does that tell us about loosening of association or just people repeating things? It's exactly the same, you know, issue that you've really nicely highlighted. So I don't think that was a toy example at all. Every time I sort of think about this, I get more and more confused about like what really theoretically is the difference between sort of random versus not using context. Because in the extreme, not using context means you're ignoring context altogether, which sort of means that you're picking words randomly. And then as soon as you start to give some context, then you have to wonder, well, why is it that they could produce that context in the first place? Like if you imagine giving like 50 words of context and it's all nice and beautiful, and suddenly you're doing random. So I keep kind of coming back to like what does that really mean psychologically, the difference between random and not using context?
I think it's a great question, which I think we can actually think of as two separate questions. The first question, or the first, suggestion, I completely agree with it. If we And that's, I think, part of the reason for which, perturbing or manipulating this context variable has very non-monotonic or nonlinear effects. And I completely agree that if we give the model, zero context, it will be random or maybe rely on frequency or something like this, which is not exactly random, but we may look random to an extent. So these processes, these potential impairments can, sort of meet one another in terms of how they look in the end. I do think that there is a difference, at least from a mechanistic perspective, between thinking about memory and sort of, the kinds of things that we hold in our memory when we talk, when we produce language, and our ability to keep things in memory, be that what we said before, what our conversation partner said before, or be that our goals in trying to reach something with this conversation. I think this is different from everything that has to do with the actual choice or production itself. We could, I think, it's not too far-fetched to think that the problem or part of the problem might lie in something that has to do with the neural networks and with the random firing of neural networks and with different neuromodulators that are responsible for that or that affect that could only lead to more random choices in the end. Maybe one of the behavioral or self-reported ways to distinguish these two has to do with insight or the extent to which I will be I will have some insight about the unintelligibility of what I just said. If temperature is what causes this, I might be able to capture this or to know this, because think about this, a simple behavioral experiment where we have to choose one of three things, and then because of something that has to do with the random noise or the stochasticity that is always there with our choices, you choose the wrong answer, the wrong cue or something like that. If this is the mechanism that led to this problematic choice, you will know that, right? You will notice this immediately, and you will even get like a nice ERP sort of in these cases. So I think maybe this is one of the ways to think about this distinction. I think
Yeah,
Lena
that's
had a question.
thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Isaac. I'll keep it brief. Again, brilliant work. I've read it many times. The question I had is, I think we can see most of the time the nature of formal thought disorder, speech transcripts we have this problem of integration of long-term context. And I think we can say that happening many times when we have a severe formal thought disorder person in front of us. But occasionally, not completely impossible, but occasionally we also see stochastic word choices, random choices getting inserted in it. For example, the sample you showed had a word abulation. You cannot produce that with just one word context even. So my question is, could there be a mix of both mechanisms happening in schizophrenia? And do we have models that can test different proportion of the mix of mechanisms?
It's a really good question. It definitely can, and things always becomes more complicated
Hmm.
when they look like this, both here and in computational psychiatry in general. Um, So in principle, we can use the method I proposed to just manipulate both things, and create this like sort of whatever 4 by 4 nice table. I think that maybe for this to actually work properly, rather to be just a proof of concept, we need to think of ways to improve, and we'll talk about this maybe towards the end, about the limitations to improve the actual generative model, to make it as similar as possible to real speech. Because if we're actually testing these complex interactions, we need much more precision in the model than we need when we actually only test a single variable.
Thanks.
So I think maybe I'll continue unless there are other questions. Okay.
Go ahead.
Yeah, no. Okay. So the second study I want to show here today has to do with the perhaps not so trivial need to dissociate processes that have to do with perseveration from processes that have to do with derailment. And to try and sort of demonstrate why this is important, let's think about how we usually interpret, or how we might interpret NLP metrics of semantic distance, again, focusing only on semantic distance in the context of psychiatry and schizophrenia. So derailment as part of positive thought disorder, we usually expect to find larger semantic distances between, again, sentences or words, and so on and so forth. If we were interested in measuring something like perseveration, repetition, repetitiveness in speech, that could be related to negative thought disorder, although there's a debate about whether it really goes into the negative or positive part, but it's definitely related to a form of thought disorder, but could also relate to other conditions like major depression, perhaps. And if we want to measure something like this, and we were to use semantic distance metrics, maybe we will expect to find decreased semantic distances, or rather increased cosine similarities between, again, words or sentences, and so on and so forth. So I think this already starts to demonstrate a problem we can get. And the problem has to do with the fact that we don't really have a good way to know where the optimal middle, or where the optimal point stands, right? So if too much cosine distance at derailment, too less cosine distance at perseveration, how do we know what is a good amount of cosine distance between sentences or words? And obviously it becomes much more complicated if we think about the the fact that different texts, different questions, different kinds of data will have a different optimum, and it will really, really vary between. So we really don't have a way to a priori, I think, define like the good middle, the optimum point of cosine distance, and from that to know where we find deviations. Things become even more complicated, and we think about the fact that people with schizophrenia sometimes can show both derailment and perseveration. I think even in some cases they can show both within the same answer, or within the same text, or within the same narrative. So if we have both, should we expect to find cosine distance that is somewhere along or around this optimum point, around the middle? And if this is indeed the case, does this mean that if we use cosine distance, we won't be able to tell apart someone who has both derailment and perseveration from someone who actually produces, if you wish, normal answer or intelligible answer? So to try and examine this question, we extended the approach I showed before, using again the temperature manipulation, but on top of that, we added another manipulation. And I think I also wanted to say that this work has been led by the brilliant Robin Kulevich from Paris. I think is about to move soon, but from Paris. So in addition to the manipulation of temperature, which you saw before, we added another manipulation. And this manipulation was simply paraphrasing. For paraphrasing, we used actually more fine-tuned state-of-the-art models, because these models have turned out to work the best, better than specific models that have been developed for paraphrasing. So this is GPT-3, if I remember correctly. And here you see an example of a narrative that is both has a high temperature and has a paraphrase. So it goes like this. Most people start the day by thinking a number of questions. So we already see the high temperature effects. I'm not sure how you are and when. We continue to see the high temperature effects. Individuals usually consider different questions on each day. We see the paraphrase here. And importantly, in these paraphrases, we only wanted to focus on semantic paraphrasing and not just lexical repetition, not because lexical repetition is not important, but rather because it's sort of an easier problem to solve, because we can just, count the words to examine lexical repetition. So why semantic distance metrics might be not suitable in this case? Here's again an illustrative example. We look at these three sentences that we saw before. What we will find is that the semantic distance between the first sentence and the last sentence, the paraphrase, is very small, as expected. And the semantic distance between both of them and the sentence in the middle is very large. The point is that if we were to take a narrative that is also somewhat derailed, but less derailed, and doesn't have any paraphrasing in it, and then we will get one semantic distance that is 0.44, another that is 0.46, the average semantic distance is actually the same. So at least if we take focus on the average semantic distance, this might struggle to tease these derailment and repetition components apart. So what Robin has done is basically develop a bunch of alternative NLP metrics that do not focus on distance per se, but focus on what we can think of as density metrics. And this has been inspired by previous work that has actually proposed something along these lines. We try to really test this in a systematic way. So what density metrics do in a, again, a very simplified explanation, is basically dimensionality reduction over sentences. So what this would mean is that if we have three sentences in the example to the left, and we were to apply some sort of a dimensionality reduction algorithm, we will be able to see that these three sentences, we can actually explain them by two sentences, because the first and the third sentences, the paraphrased ones, are sort of the same sentence, so we can explain them with one sentence. And here we can see how these dimensionality reduction techniques of different sorts might be able to actually help us better detect repetition and tease it apart from derailment or lack thereof. The actual work included using a bunch of state-of-the-art semantic distance metrics and developing a bunch of dimensionality reduction metrics, and then running a machine learning algorithm to see, if we give these metrics the best chance they can separately, can they actually detect derailment? Can they actually detect perseveration? So this gives us this 4x4 classification problem where we want the models to dissociate or classify medium versus low temperature cases, and cases with paraphrase versus cases without paraphrase. And so the orange cells here would represent cases where the model has failed to detect repetitiveness. The purple ones are failures to detect incoherence, and the red ones are failures to dissociate them, right? So these cases with medium temperature with paraphrase and low temperature without paraphrase, which again can actually look the same in terms of semantic distance. So here are the results. What we see here is that semantic distance metrics are worse in detecting repetitiveness in comparison to semantic density metrics. All of these are error rates. And again, at the top, we see semantic distance. At the bottom, we see semantic density metrics. So we see that the error rates for repetitiveness are lower for the density metrics. In contrast to this, the error rates for detecting derailment are actually lower for the semantic distance metrics. So we're starting to see this nice partial dissociation here, suggesting that maybe when we combine these measures, they can do better. When we combine these measures, they do better to some extent, but not as good as we would have expected them to. So there's definitely some work to be done in what would be the best way to combine these two classes of metrics. But the key point is that, again, using this generative language model approach, we might be able to improve our ability to detect repetitiveness and derailment separately, and maybe even to tease them apart when they happen within the same text. This is just another demonstration this is a large non-clinical sample, around 1,000 people who filled out a bunch of questionnaires, and we used factor analysis to derive empirical psychiatric dimensions from these questionnaires. This was published separately. But what I want to show you here is that we also found that semantic density metrics are better at detecting what we think is perseveration. And by think is perseveration, what I mean is they're better at detecting abnormalities or effects in dimensions, psychiatric dimensions, that we expect to show perseveration. So we see this basically finding in a dimension that we call reduced speech, but really is about negative thought disorder. We also see a finding in negative affect that is really related to depression. And we also see reduced density, which again indicates perseveration in this higher level psychiatric dimension, which we called internalizing symptoms more generally. In some of these dimensions, the distance metrics worked as well, but in others, they did not. So in these internalizing symptom dimensions, for example, the distance metrics were not really able to capture any kind of repetitiveness or something along these lines. So to sum up, I think that a point that is, maybe we all can agree about is that we do have to understand what the NLP metrics we use actually measure, because we use so many of them and in so many use cases. I try to propose and maybe demonstrate how theory-driven simulations using generative language models can be a promising approach for this purpose. This approach can maybe bring language modeling in psychiatry closer to common standards in computational psychiatry in general, a procedure known as parameter recovery, which is something we often have to do to test that our models measure what we want them or capture what we want them to capture. And I really want to conclude with this quote that I like from Westerman that might again look a bit provocative, but he suggested or said something like, "Do not trust an explanation that you cannot simulate." So even if it takes too many steps ahead, so maybe it's a nice sentence to think about at least. These approaches are not without limitations. So these models are trained on corpora with specific characteristics, everything in writing, the whole internet or it has been trained on a lot of things that have nothing to do with natural speech. These foundation models that have not gone through fine-tuning are prone to different issues like natural repetitiveness and require different ad hoc tricks to produce intelligible text. So all of these things sort of challenge the validity of this approach in actually capturing what might be happening with naturalistic speech. Again, the manipulation we used focused on the generation process, not the actual memory of the model, and this might maybe misrepresent the cognitive mechanisms underlying language disturbances. And finally, it is still unclear to me, at least, how we can use this approach to manipulate and test mechanisms that have to do with syntactic alterations and with metrics that are not related to semantic distance. So I just wanted to thank the collaborators in these two projects, my funders. Thank you so much for listening. Thank my lab members. And if you are interested in the studies, the second is a preprint soon to be published. You have the QR codes right here.
Thank you very much, Isaac. This has been a wonderful talk. Now we have some moments for questions, so please raise your hands. I can already see that Sylvia is asking something in the chat box. So Sylvia, you want to ask something?
Yeah, thank you so much for the talk. Something in relation to the first paper that you presented. So we did find that manipulating the context before in predicting next word perplexity in our case gave a different result depending on the models we tested. So I was wondering like whether we should become the more restrictive about which corpora we use for training the model, or whether we should as I said, exploit these changes as potential different hypotheses about language.
So I think I understood both parts of your question. I think I didn't really, if you can just say a bit more about the connection. Why is the way in which context changes the perplexity will affect the kind of corpora we train the models on?
Yeah, so basically we looked at perplexity like in models like GPT, Llama, Quen, and we look at the context size per group interaction, where group were healthy people and people with schizophrenia. And we did see that sometimes there was an interaction. So the more context you give and the more advantage gives to the patient. Other time, the more in other models, the more context you give, the more advantage it gives to the healthy control. So when at the end of the day, we had to wrap up our results, it was completely scattered. So that made us think it depends on the corpora that the models were trained on. Probably.
That's a really interesting question. Okay, now I understand it. Thank you. That's a really interesting question and a not trivial one at all, because for the simulations, we had to choose a certain large language model. And if different large language models somewhat behave differently with the same context or with the same differences of context, this might be a problem. Maybe we can think of a way to actually use this approach to partly solve the problem. And what I mean by that, that if we use this generative approach of simulations and we test it across different fixed context levels, but then we compare the results of perplexity or whatever metric you want to use across the different models, maybe we can find sort of the points of equivalence, right? The right way to align. So maybe something like, for this model, a context of 20 words or 20 words, let's say, is equivalent to a different model's context of 30 words or something like this. Maybe using simulations, we might be able to find this point of equivalence and then run the analysis. And then maybe you will find more consistent effects. But hard to say.
That's a great idea. Thanks.
Thank you.
Do we have any other questions? Go ahead, Wolfram.
Yeah, thank you so much. Very thought-provoking. I have a couple of questions about semantic distance. So if I got you right, then your manipulations in study 1 actually lead to an increase in semantic distance. But what we see in schizophrenia actually is a decrease in semantic distance in most recent studies that I'm aware of. So I think there's a bit of a disconnect there. And the other problem is that you would expect if incoherence involves anything like derailment or something like that, you would also, on your thinking, I think, map this on an increase in semantic distance. But we are actually, in a recent study which is submitted, we are actually not finding any connection between semantic distance and coherence measures. Not in neurotypicals and very large databases, not in clinical samples. So I'm getting extremely skeptical about the idea of semantic distance as measuring really something which is of interest in our context. And so the decrease in semantic distance, I think, maps onto greater compression of the semantic space in schizophrenia. You mentioned dimensionality reduction also as a method. And there's actually recent work by Claudio Palominos in my group showing that the semantic space in schizophrenia is more compressible than in controls, which is, I think, consistent with that idea of a decrease in semantic distance or higher semantic similarity, or a more dense or more compressed or more clumpy semantic space.
Thank you for both questions. they're very, very interested and intriguing. So regarding starting from the easier question, the first one, so I think that part of what we showed in the first study is that increasing the temperature predicts an increase in semantic distance. But what we also showed is that inducing an impairment of context, basically reducing the model's memory span, can actually lead to a reduction of semantic distance, which is very complicated and depends on the exact reduction, the exact model, and so on and so forth. So maybe some of the findings that have to do and that actually tie and connect tangentiality specifically with reductions in semantic distance, maybe they can be explained by this mechanism. Maybe others can be explained by some sort of perseveration, which can also or is also expected to lead to a reduction in semantic distance. I don't really have an answer. I think that what we see is mainly how the extent to which different mechanisms can, in interaction, like Elena suggested, lead to very complicated results that we might often miss if we just use semantic distance and only rely on its, sort of intuitive interpretation. So I think that maybe this sort of simulation-based approach can help here to a certain extent. The second question or note you had, I think it's really, really interesting. And I'd love to read the paper and to look more into this. I think it's really interesting because it suggests that maybe perseveration and other maybe that's what you were saying, I'm just reiterating this, but nothing new, and other thought disorder symptoms can all be traced back to this compression of semantic space, or maybe some of them trace back to this compression of semantic space, which is sort of a broader mechanistic perspective on what we see in the output as perseveration. It's very interesting. I'd love to hear more about it.
Thank you.
I think Gina has a question and Lena, so sorry, I'm not the one who's supposed to do this.
It's okay. You can go. I'm not sure which one was first, Lena or Gina.
Okay, I'll keep it short if I can go first. Isaac, this is really ambitious program, theory-driven manipulation of language variables. I'm trying to think if we can be even more ambitious, trying to get developmental parameters of language development and see, how, most of the models you're using is foundation models out of the bag and try to manipulate some parameters cross-sectionally. Have you thought about manipulating the development of evolution of language knowledge in the models?
Yes and no. We have been playing around recently in my lab with combining developmental perspective with a simulation-based approach, but we have only been using it with very simple, like word level sort of semantic networks, associative networks, and simple sort of bag of words models. I I think it would be very ambitious and interesting to think about, training a large language model with different developmental components in mind. But I definitely agree that it's super interesting and important. And I always have in mind, I'm sorry, but I forgot the authors of this classical paper about a schizotypy, who proposed this theory of thought disorder and eccentricity that evolves schizotypy as something that is indeed related to a developmental vicious cycle that can, result in or happen during adolescence, where basically social exclusion can lead to the strengthening of or the semantic networks becoming more and more or less and less aligned with the rest of the population. I think it's super fascinating and interesting, and we are working a lot on this, but not with large language models. That will be too much for us. Gina, do you?
Yeah, I just wanted to sort of come back to this point of semantic similarity measures, because I think what you beautifully highlighted is that you can exploit large language models and use simulations to sort of illustrate how your choice of the metric can have very, very different meanings. I guess I would also want to encourage people to just look at a huge amounts of psychological literature showing exactly the same thing. So, I've always so word to vec. You can compute word to vec between the final word that you've produced and the one preceding word, between that word and then two preceding words. You could use, word to vec between adjacent words. You could use the word and its semantic similarity to the entire preceding context. And then you could use window sizes. I mean, all of these have extremely difficult different psychological interpretations, and they map onto mechanisms that we've known about for years in both comprehension and production. So we know that in healthy adults, at least during comprehension, probably production, we go on the entire context that we've incrementally built up. We don't go, by one single word, but we do when it's really, really local, like one word. Then you can go over and above context. So, and that's attributable to priming mechanisms, very basic bottom-up priming mechanisms. Remember, priming is used in a very, sometimes it's used mechanistically, and sometimes it's used just descriptively, almost synonymous with word to vec. So but what I'm sort of saying is that, and there's different kinds of top down, there's use of a whole schema, which can be summarized by a very broad semantic similarity between one word and its entire preceding context, if you use something like LSA, or even a very average word to vec kind of measure. So, I mean, for me, it's just meaningless to say, like semantic similarity. I mean, it can be anything. And so, picking your measure very wisely to test psychological theory, in addition to, as you beautifully showed, sort of simulating and just looking at your data, that just seems to me to be common sense and incredibly important. Otherwise, nothing we do has any face validity unless you're using it purely to predict, which can be useful. And, like bringing a bunch of different measures and say, can I predict blindly, can also be really useful. But if you're trying to understand, then, I mean, it just makes all the sense in the world. And so I'm really glad that you're bringing to the forefront like this problem we have in the field with people using word2vec to refer to vastly different things. It's sort of like, it could be anything. So thank you.
Primo. Thank you.
Okay. Well, thanks. Thank you so much, Isaac, for this great presentation and discussion. Thanks everyone for participating. We do have an announcement. We have the last talk of this year on December 5th. It will be by Francisca Noll. She will talk about alterations in predictive language processing in different stages of psychosis. And we also have the announcement of our fourth consortium meeting, Language and Thought in the Brain and in Mental Health. And it will be in Pavia, hosted by Dr. Valentina Bambini on March 30 and 31 on 2026. Lena, do you want to add anything to that? To that
No,
announcement?
we covered everything. We sent an email for initial registration of interest. It should be on if you search for Discourse emails, you should be able to find it.
Okay, thanks everyone. See you soon.
Thank you for a beautiful talk.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
It's been a really great discussion. Thank you.